So some of this paper is a contemporary reworking of a chapter I wrote in 2015 with Karen Ritzenhoff for our book, Selling Sex on Screen. I'm hoping there's no one here familiar with the book. My mum couldn't make it today, so I'm hoping Okay, so in the current popular re-evaluations of Stanley Kubrick's work, observation is often made that his films were uncannily prescient. 2001: A Space Odyssey is frequently lauded as demonstrating future technologies, and Dr. Strangelove is cited as showing a political landscape horrifyingly similar to the current era of Trump. However, in the current context, I would argue that Eyes Wide Shut is the Kubrick film that most urgently speaks to our times. After I wrote my abstract, I saw that I'm not the only one to make this connection. In the current Sight and Sound, Eyes Wide Shut Special Edition, Hannah McGill discusses some of these parallels, but I believe the film's relevance goes beyond anecdotal similarities and the coincidences that can be found with a conspiratorial lens. The film's real strength is the way that these issues now allow it to connect to a new audience by reflecting their deeper cultural concerns. When we consider the Epstein scandal and the shady world of privilege, exploitation, and secrets coming to light, we can see uncanny echoes of Kubrick's final film. When considering the Me Too movement and the silencing of women by powerful men like Harvey Weinstein, we're reminded of the plight of Mandy and the ways that the system enables the rich to circumvent justice. Bill's journey, alone and confused, alienated by women's sexuality and society, mirrors the frustrations of incels, the angry, misogynistic, involuntary celibate community that has developed online and has resulted in terrible violent crimes against women. The recent hugely popular Joker film was accused of sympathetically portraying an incel-type character. Joker owes a lot to Scorsese's Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, but the journey of the main protagonist and his frustrations also brings us to the current relevance of Eyes Wide Shut and its opportunity to be re-evaluated and appreciated by a new audience. Eyes Wide Shut is primarily a film that focuses on a male lead venturing on a sexual and psychological journey to the edge. It explores the effects of alienation on the male psyche, the inability to connect on an interpersonal level with others, and the mechanics of paid-for sex outside normative monogamous relationships. In the film, we see Bill, played by Tom Cruise, spend time with prostitutes and late at night pound the city streets searching for new thrills. Ultimately, it's the fear of his wife's fantasy of promiscuity and passion that sends him spiraling out of control. The difference between reality and fantasy and the crisis this rift evokes is central to the narrative. This paper focuses on the role of women and female sexuality in the film. By looking at the metaphors of machines, mirrors, martyrs, and money, and Jeremy also mentioned masks, the other M in the film, we can explore what Kubrick was saying about marriage and masculinity. Evidence from primary research in the Stanley Kubrick Archive tells us more about the film and Kubrick's aims in making it. By focusing on the important female characters, we can discuss the ways in which this film, that may appear to be about male sexuality, is more about male vulnerability and the fear of female sexual power. When considering the metaphor of machines in the film, we can employ Sarah Shashchek's essay, Fucking Machines, High-Tech Bodies in Pornography. Shashchek asks why pornography is so fascinated with depicting the body as a machine and links it to the commodification of the human body through Michel Foucault's discussion of the economy of pleasure and Linda Williams' notion that sexual activities have an element of the mechanical, of the body as machine. In Eyes Wide Shut, the famous orgy scene is a mechanical, machine-like representation of the male sexual fantasy. We see women robotically performing sex acts, their bodies further commodified by their masks, shielding their identity and hiding their expressions. Men pump in and out of the near-identical perfect female bodies like machines. Women in their masks act out kissing, but without any actual physical contact. It's a hollow display for male arousal. In a 1995 letter from co-writer Frederick Raphael to Kubrick, Raphael discusses the scene. The essence of the party is to excite Bill and ourselves, the audience, for him to feel, going in at least, that this is the life. The mechanical women at the orgy, with their perfectly groomed bodies, are expensive objects of desire, out of reach for Bill. He's given only a glimpse of this other fantasy world. He's an outsider here, as he is an outsider in his wife's sexual fantasy life. When Alice, played by Nicole Kidman, first makes her explicit dream revelation to Bill, he's shocked to find out he's not the focus of her fantasies and desires. In an early version of the screenplay, Alice describes her fantasy. At this stage of the film's pre-production, the object of her desire was a surfer and not the naval officer in the film. She talks of him pumping in and out of this woman like this machine. He was so sure of himself. Bill feels hurt and rejected by Alice's revelations. And in Kubrick's research notes, we see a passage underlined from Karen Horney's The Neurotic Personality of Our Time in the chapter titled Recoiling from Competition. A rebuff of any kind, which, as we have seen, the neurotic reacts to with intense hostility, is likewise felt as a failure, and therefore as a humiliation. The idea of the mirror in cinema comes from Lacanian film theory and the idea of the infant recognizing herself in the same way the film viewer recognizes herself in a character. When we see a male lead character recognizing himself in an important female character, as in this film, we get an interesting perspective that challenges Laura Mulvey's much-cited theory of the male gaze, contesting our notions of male-female differences. Kasia Silverman looks at the mirror in cinema from a feminist perspective in her book, The Acoustic Mirror, The Female Voice in Psychoanalysis in Cinema, and discusses voyeurism, exhibitionism, narcissism, and identification, giving us tools to explore the use of mirrors as metaphors in this film. Mirrors are used in many scenes in Eyes Wide Shut, and Alice, more than any other character, is associated with them. Eyes Wide Shut opens with her undressing in her bedroom as she gets ready for a night out. As Tim Creeder discusses, we see her giving her reflection a critical once-over in the mirror before leaving for the party, and a look of frank self-assessment in the medicine cabinet when she decides to get stoned. Her expression in the mirror as she watches her husband making love to her begins as bemusement, giving way to fondness and arousal, but in the last second, it becomes something more ambiguous, distracted, and self-conscious. We see her tending to herself, getting dressed and undressed, applying makeup, brushing her hair. She's devoted to the rigorous maintenance of her looks. Being beautiful is Alice's job, as much as it is the ex-beauty queen Cool Girl Mandy's or the prostitute Domino's. She's a kept woman, supported financially by her husband as her art gallery is folded. Her role is to be looked at. From her first appearance on screen, undressing, to her first question to her husband, how do I look? And then everyone from the babysitter to Victor Ziegler at the ball compliments her on her appearance. Parallels with the other characters throughout the film suggest Alice's real status, the wife as prostitute. The character Domino can be seen as a metaphorical mirror. She reflects back Bill's behaviour and forces him to look at himself and the direction he's taking. In a letter from Frederick Raphael to Kubrick from 1995, it seems that her character was toned down. In the first draft, I somewhat forced myself to make Wanda, Domino, into as predatory hooker as I could imagine, but I do think the revised scene will play better and less scandalously. An early manuscript sees her finding out Bill is a doctor and asking him to check something on her breast, where he finds what may be a cyst. The revised version, where they're instead interrupted by a phone call from Alice, and then later with Bill being told Domino is HIV positive, has the same purpose in interrupting Bill's fantasy with cold, hard reality. For the threat of danger further serves as a warning for Bill, and he has a lucky escape. He can see a reflection of what may have been his fate. He's not upset for Domino, but for himself. A scene outline document underlines this. Bill feels relieved when he learns she's not home, and when he leaves, he feels choked with tears, not because he was deeply affected, but because his nerves were giving way. Historically, the female martyr has been an important character in our stories and religious morality tales. These women have always died for the sins of others, often men. Cinema has a rich history of these figures, from Drea's Joan of Arc to Pabst Pandora. In Eyes Wide Shut, we can see female martyrdom as the ultimate sexual masochism. Sam Dehan looks at this phenomenon in Female Pleasure and Performance, Masochism in Belle de Jour and Histoire d'Eau. She discusses the problematic nature of Mulvey's theory of the male gaze when looking at these films. This is true of our example too. She points out that while the women are undeniably objects of sexual objectification, they manage to subvert masculine control and bourgeois values with their sexually masochistic performances. In Eyes Wide Shut, the mysterious woman at the orgy sacrificed herself to save Bill with the words, "Stop, let him go, take me, I'm ready to redeem him." And so Bill is set free on the premise he'll not say a word about what he has seen. Scene outlines describe his psychological journey. Who was this woman who sacrificed herself for him? Why did he try to believe it was a sacrifice? It had been a joke, of course. Later in the cafe, he sees the newspaper article describing Mandy's death by overdose, and his thoughts change. He had to find her. No one would stop him from finding the woman who had died on his account, who had in fact died for him. He was the cause of her death, he alone. If it was she, yes, he decides, it was she. Bill is summoned by his influential, rich acquaintance, Victor Ziegler, who warns him to stop his investigation and aggressively dismisses his concern for the woman. That whole play-acted, take-me, phony sacrifice you've been jerking yourself off with had absolutely nothing to do with her real death. Nothing happened to her after you left the party that hadn't happened to her before. She got her brains fucked out. This line, rather like Jack's ominous line from The Shining, "I'm not going to hurt you, I'm just going to bash your brains in," leaves Bill and the audience unsure of what really happened. Is it Bill's fantasy that this woman sacrificed herself for him, or did it really happen? It's the ultimate compliment to his damaged ego, revenge and retribution for his humiliation by Alice. He's important enough that a woman would die for him. Money and sex are inextricably linked. In his essay on Eyes Wide Shut, Introducing Sociology, Tim Creeder suggests that we see prostitution as the most basic defining transaction of our society. In her book, Sexual Solipsism, Ray Langton draws on feminist theory and looking at the objectification and commodification of women, and shows how a kind of solipsism is involved, a failure to treat women as fully human. She explores the Kantian idea that there's something wrong with treating a person as a thing, and adds an epistemological dimension that's a belief about women as subordinate that allows this to happen in our capitalist patriarchal society. This viewpoint can help us to criticize the world of the men in this film. The first line in Eyes Wide Shut sets the tone for the entire film. Bill says to his wife, "Honey, have you seen my wallet?" Alice replies, "Isn't it on the bedside table?" Creeder points out she's a possession, he's a buyer. Money is associated with sex throughout the film and repeatedly mentioned. Almost everyone in the film prostitutes themselves for various prices. This is certainly true of the women in the film, from Alice the kept wife to Domino the prostitute, to Mandy, who Ziegler dismisses by saying to Bill, "She was a hooker, sorry, that's what she was." During Bill's second encounter at Rainbow Costume Rentals, after Bill has seen the young girl cavorting sexually with two older men, the girl's father, Milich, explains that he came to an agreement with the men. Milich hugs his scantily clad young daughter beside the cash register and suggestively says, "If the good doctor should ever want anything else, anything at all, it needn't be a costume." Bill is very uncomfortable. He's also awkward about money and sex during the encounter with Domino. "So, do you suppose we should talk about money?" He asks. Domino takes control of the scope of the sexual encounter and encourages Bill to leave the evening up to her. However, Bill's cell phone rings and he's reined in by his wife checking on him. He lies to her, but after the call, Bill does not want to perform the infidelity. But instead, he still insists on counting out three $50 bills and handing them to Domino. Bill's nocturnal journey into clandestine sex is also a journey into a world of wealth and power where he does not belong. The orgy scene is a sexual display, but Bill is not welcome here. His arrival by taxi and the ticket in his rented suit are signs he does not belong. Frederick Raphael states in a manuscript note, Bill is ejected from the party back into reality with a warning not to mix outside his class again. Victor Ziegler confronts Bill about his covert presence at the party, putting him back in his place. You've been well out of your depth for the last 24 hours. Those were not ordinary people there. I'm not going to tell you their names, but if I did, I don't think you'd sleep so well. Bill crosses his own sexual boundaries. He steps outside the world of bourgeois marital fidelity by lying to his wife while seeking pleasure and adventure outside the confines of their marriage. Conversely, Alice uses her wedding ring as a sign of her married status, which supposedly makes her unavailable for other sexual pursuits, rebuffing the handsome stranger at the party by holding up her hand and displaying her ringed finger. However, their relationship is not beyond repair, and now that Dr. Bill has witnessed the spectrum of female desire, he can more fully embrace his own wife's needs and follow her lead. Eyes Wide Shut closes with the re-establishment of marital fidelity. Bill and Alice are at a busy toy store, shopping with their daughter Helena. They're surrounded by commercials and Christmas displays and toys galore. When Helena runs off to look at toys, Bill emotionally asks Alice, "What do you think we should do?" She replies, "I think we should be grateful that we've managed to survive through all our adventures, whether they were real or only a dream." They discuss how they'll move forward, and Alice finally says, "There is something important we need to do as soon as possible." Bill replies, "What's that?" Looking into his eyes, Alice says, "Fuck." Then the film cuts to black. Here she introduces her husband to the fact that she can operate in both realms. She can be whorish while also being a mother and a wife. An early version of the screenplay was titled Woman Unknown, and the final scene was much more like Schnitzler's original, with the couple in bed together and the final realization by Bill that it is as if she were a stranger and his wife, and so she is. Oh, it's not finished. Do you want me to hurry up, Jeremy?
No, it was great. I loved it.
Okay.
Got 2 minutes.
Ultimately, Eyes Wide Shut ends with redemption. The film is about cerebral fantasy as opposed to harsh reality. In the real world, Bill does not experience the satisfaction and pleasure he thought he'd been looking for. This neurotic male character reacts with fear and hostility when confronted with the possibility of failure and humiliation, and he struggles to deal with the messy truth of human relationships. The women Bill encounters have no shame or guilt, which is how they differ from the men throughout the film. The film focuses on disconnection and male inadequacies. It's women who show Bill what real sexuality is about and force him to look at himself. This brings about a deeper connection and a new beginning for husband and wife. By exploring these themes and understanding the roles within Eyes Wide Shut, we can go on to placing the film within the Kubrick canon. Eyes Wide Shut is described in the New Sight and Sound issue as an outlier in the Kubrick back catalogue. It's often considered a demonstration of Kubrick's late style, contradictory in the Saïdian sense. But I believe it's quite the opposite. The film extends Kubrick's body of work by underlining his perpetual ability to connect with themes that are relevant to modern society, and it follows in Kubrick's continual exploration of toxic masculinity, as demonstrated in much of his earlier work. Beginning with Lolita, we see the obsessive Humbert manipulating and trying to control. Dr. Strangelove shows us men obsessed with their own power and controlling their sexuality. In A Clockwork Orange, male violence and the rape of women is presented. Barry Lyndon gives us a vain narcissist with a destructive sense of entitlement. The Shining explores male failure, frustration, and domestic violence, and Full Metal Jacket reflects toxic masculinity in a war zone, violence, exploitation, humiliation, and its tragic consequences. Interestingly, the key female characters in many of these films ultimately escape or defeat the men. It could be argued there are other Kubrick films that explore toxic masculinity, but since 1962, every film Kubrick made, apart from 2001: A Space Odyssey, features a problematic male protagonist who damages or destroys the people or relationships around him. But perhaps we could even include Hal in this list. Maybe I can make it seem like I'm going to stop. Tiny one paragraph left. So why is Eyes Wide Shut more relevant in 2019 than it ever was? I recently had the pleasure of having dinner with my friend Peter Kramer, and he described to me that on the Kubrick Studies course he teaches, on which he screens and discusses nearly all of Kubrick's films, Eyes Wide Shut is the film that opens up and provokes the most animated discussions with his students. Beyond the anecdotal connections to contemporary society, the film also presents real questions about sex, sexuality, gender roles, privilege, relationships, truth, and reality. The real reason that Eyes Wide Shut is now more relevant than ever is that it speaks to the young, so-called woke generation. Perhaps the film that Kubrick laboured over for so many years has finally come of age and found its place in Kubrick's oeuvre and in the fears and desires of a new audience.